And we did have a last-minute change, as sometimes happens at conferences. I'll explain that when our speaker comes in. So I am not Jochen Achilles, and our speaker will not be Flickr Small. Unfortunately, again, we had a last-minute cancellation, so this is not on your program yet. We are delighted and very fortunate to have our original chair as speaker now. This is really a wonderful coincidence that Jochen Achilles is actually not only a chair, but also someone who has worked a lot in Irish studies and who volunteered, was perhaps slightly pushed. More pushed than wanted. So it's my real pleasure, delight, and privilege to introduce to you now our speaker, Professor Jochen Achilles, who was actually a professor and chair of American Studies here at the University of Würzburg, and who is a member of Irish Studies Würzburg. And this is real dedication to have his paper printed last night, gone over it again, probably during the night, and now present. So thank you for that. He has published widely, worked widely on Irish literature, especially Irish drama, on John O'Kenzie, and also one of the writers we hear about today, Le Fanu or Le Fanu. We just talked about the pronunciation, several ways to pronounce this. He has also published essays, essay collections, many of them on different topics, obviously on liminality and the short story. And the short story is one of his recurring research interests as well. Boundary crossings in American, Canadian, British writing. There's one of the collections here, and also many other articles and books and collections on the American short story, African American, and also on Irish drama. And this will be another chance now for us, our conference, to work also comparatively. So this is also what we'll be hearing today then in his talk on monkey business in intercultural and intertextual perspective, species, and ethnos orientation in, and now we have the comparative part, pose the murders in the morgue. And if I'm not mistaken, Franca mentioned it actually in her abstract as well. Yeah, the monkey there. And Le Fanu's Green Tea short story, and also in Spofford Circumstances. A warm welcome, a special welcome actually to Jochen Achilles.
Thank you, anybody, for your introduction. Back then, from concrete and real animals to imaginary ones, very imaginary ones in part. Edgar Allan Poe's The Murders in the Rue Morgue has generated both universalist and more culture-specific readings. Even as he invents the genre of detective fiction, Poe questions its epistemological limitations, the processes by which detection constructs truth, suppressing realities as fully as illuminating them. The Paris setting of The Murders in the Rue Morgue has, on the one hand, been considered as an urban center which subverts both cognitive and linguistic orientation, quote, a world city that becomes a 19th century Babel, end quote. From a biographical angle, it has also been described as a displaced Baltimore. Such divergent interpretations suggest that the story may have both a larger intercultural or epochal, universal, and a more concretely American dimension. Making sense of the story has led to the question what the ape in it signifies beyond being a very general representation of the irrational and instinctual. The gendered view sees the ape as representing patriarchy. A post-colonial perspective reveals the ape as a stand-in for the colonized other. General notions are flanked by specific ones. In the story, the ape is, as in Tana French's novels, a sort of absentee animal. It is not present, really. It is only inferred by Dupin. In the following, I will try to delineate both more universalist and more culture-specific approaches respectively. I will try to demonstrate the pertinence of both approaches by the examination of animals in two other 19th century stories, Green Tea, which stands for the more universalist aspect, a tale by Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu, who has been called the Irish Poe by critics, in which a London cleric falls victim to a furious monkey, and Circumstance of 1860, an American frontier story by Harriet Prescott Spofford, in which a panther called the Indian Devil attacks a woman in the wilderness. Green Tea, originally published in All the Year Round in 1869, is the first story of In a Glass Darkly, the collection of Le Fanu's best tales, among them his famous vampire story, Camilla, which are presented as medical case studies. All of these stories are presented as medical case studies of Dr. Martin Hesselius, a German physician. Green Tea is Le Fanu's most subtle discussion of the relationship between scientific rationalism and the Christian worldview, also the most ambivalent one. In Green Tea, the position of Christian orthodoxy is represented by the affluent and unmarried Reverend Mr. Jennings, who lives mostly in London and does not attend to his vicarage in Warwickshire. The voice of scientific rationalism is Dr. Hesselius, the narrator of the tale. Jennings and Hesselius act out the conflict between, on the one hand, a secularized trust in the capacity of the human intellect to structure the world, and on the other, the traditional belief in a divine creator who orders the universe according to his own unfathomable insight. The animal is going to come. What renders this conflict ambivalent is the fact that Hesselius and Jennings are not simply opposed to each other, but rather tend to accept and adopt each other's positions, one expression of the Victorian religious crisis. Although nominally antagonistic, the worldviews of Hesselius and Jennings prove to be remarkably similar. Hesselius's understanding of medical science is not at all empiristically orthodox. He sees himself as a, quote, medical philosopher and writes essays on metaphysical medicine. In these essays, life and the world both encapsulate and repress, as it were, their spiritual nature. Only in death does this spiritual nature reveal itself as such, freed from all material encrustations. Only death is the real life, a view which would not surprise us if held by a theologian of Jennings's description, but it appears decidedly ironic in a physician. One would not want to consult him. It turns out that Jennings's theological concepts are as unorthodox as Hesselius's medical ones. Jennings reads Hesselius's book on metaphysical medicine and agrees with every word of it. Hesselius confesses that his theories are influenced by Emanuel Swedenborg. In Jennings's library, he promptly finds a complete set of Swedenborg's Arcana Celestia. Hesselius finishes his readings from Swedenborg's work by a passage which prepares for the central image of Green Tea. Central image. Swedenborg argues that evil spirits can haunt human beings in the shape of wild beasts. Here we are. Evil spirits, this is a quote, present themselves by correspondence, the key term of Swedenborg's theology, in the shape of the beast, which represents their particular lust and life in aspect direful and atrocious, end quote. Jennings's theological unorthodoxy manifests itself not only in his interests in Swedenborg and in his sympathies for Hesselius's mystical medicine, it finds its chief expression in his study of the metaphysical doctrines of the ancients. Quote, paganism, a degrading fascination, God forgive me, he says. Despite these misgivings, Jennings's fascination for pagan belief systems increases. Like Le Fanu himself, he consumes large quantities of green tea, hence the title, to be able to concentrate fully on his heretical studies. They prove inescapable like an infectious disease. As Jennings's illness consists in metaphysical disorientation, Hesselius seems to be the appropriate healer for him, as his medicine is metaphysically rather than scientifically oriented. Fanu's story thus negotiates both the possibility of reducing religious problems to physiological ones and the potential sublating of science and theology. The most striking symptom of Jennings's metaphysical illness is his pursuit by the apparition of a small black monkey. The monkey is Jennings's Gothicized double, as it imitates, or perhaps more appropriately apes, the clergyman's movements. It appears unfathomably malign. In the dark, the monkey is surrounded by a red demoniac aura, quote, a halo that resembles a glow of red embers, end quote. The physician Hesselius suggests the metaphysical thesis that the apparition of the demoniac animal is a Swedenborgian representation of satanic instincts. The cleric Jennings offers the medical diagnosis that the monkey may be nothing, quote, but a symptom of nervous dyspepsia, end quote. The monkey seems to signify the return of Jennings's repressed rebellious impulses against the religion whose representative he is. In distorted and demonized shape, the monkey bears traces of the irreligious sensuality and aggressiveness which Jennings sublimates in his studies of pagan rites. At one point, the monkey prevents Jennings from carrying on with the church service. It seats itself on the Bible opened at the altar so that Jennings cannot read the sacred text to his congregation anymore. Jennings also tells Hesselius that the monkey urged him to jump down a mine shaft. In other words, he tried to kill him. The monkey is thus the manifestation of a pagan spirit seen from the perspective of Christian orthodoxy. It represents both the deviation from and the dependence on this orthodoxy, sin and its punishment, reprobation, and thus both sides of Jennings's inner ideological conflict. The monkey becomes the touchstone of both the rationally scientific and the religious worldview. It is the cipher of an empty heaven, of a metaphysics of hopelessness, but it may also be considered as Jennings's hallucination, generated by his excessive consumption of green tea and sunk into the grave with him. Harriet Prescott Spofford's story, Circumstance, first published in the May 1860 issue of the Atlantic Monthly, established her as a promising writer of romantic fiction in America. The narrative falls into three parts: the unnamed female protagonist's entrance into the forest, her encounter with a wild animal, her final rescue by and return home with her husband. The setting is a frontier situation in eastern Maine. A woman returns home from a visit to her neighbors 3 miles away and has to traverse a stretch of forest, a meadow, and a copse. She lives in a house which belongs to a group of log houses. These houses lie not far apart from each other, quote, with their half-cleared demesnes separating them at the rear from the wilderness untrodden, save by stealthy native or deadly panther tribes, end quote. From the beginning, both nature and natives appear in an ambiguous fashion as both hostile other and protective cocoon. The woman's encounter with what is considered a wild beast rather than a companion species is the focus of the story. Quote, suddenly a swift shadow, like the fabulous flying dragon, writhed through the air before her, and she felt herself instantly seized and borne aloft. It was that wild beast, the most savage and serpentine and subtle and fearless of our latitudes, known by hunters as the Indian devil, and he held her in his clutches on the broad floor of a swinging fir barn, end quote. Very precarious. The appellation of the beast associates with each other what has formerly been described as separate entities, stealthy native or deadly panther tribes. The Indian devil, who literally lifts the woman off her feet, is first described as an entirely aggressive presence. To terminate the plight of her victimization by the Indian devil, the woman appeals to two masculine authorities in whom she can invest her affection without moral doubt, her husband and God, in this order. First the husband. But of course, husband ineffective, so God remains. The appeal to both these authorities takes an unusual and artistic form. When she realizes that the beast seems to hesitate and listen to the musical echo of her shouts for succor, the woman's shrieks become more melodious and she begins to serenade the animal, as it were. The first tunes she sings are charged with associations and feelings of home and her life with her husband. A cradle song for her baby calls up images of a well-protected domesticity. When the woman passes on to jigs and reels, these dance tunes rekindle memories of scenes of domestic entertainment. When the tension between the peaceful domesticity conjured up by her cradle and sea songs, dance tunes and ballads, and the continued absence of her husband becomes intolerable. The woman throws herself into God's arms, as it were. Quote, her voice forsook the songs of suffering and sorrow for old covenanting hymns, grand and sweet Methodist hymns, brimming with a melody and with all fantastic involutions of tune to suit that ecstatic worship, end quote. This devotion to a Godhead whose gospel of salvation through sacrifice and death is precariously echoed in the beast's indecision about whether to kill or caress his victim, leads to a vision of a peaceable kingdom in which nature and humanity are totally harmonized. While she is all the time in the clutches of this animal, the woman's appeal to God allows her to reinterpret this situation as her sojourn in a natural temple, which replaces the rural church of her first communion. It is also suggestive of a potential utopia of Emersonian harmony of man and nature. As in the case of the wilderness at large, which appears to be both aggressive and protective, the beast proves ambivalent too. Brute nature or ethnic otherness represented by the Indian devil are not totally adverse to the woman's musical interventions, it seems. Through forms of art, such as the woman singing, possibilities of communication and appeasement between nature and culture, as well as different ethnicities, are explored, which render realistic the visions of such appeasement transported by her songs. The Indian devil does indeed suspend his desire to devour the woman in order to listen to her homely songs and dance tunes, as well as to her hymns and prayers. A Sheridan situation develops in which the woman is singing for her life and the beast is charmed by her tunes. The Indian devil injures the woman's arm, but also caresses it. He catches her as his prey, but also strangely cradles her, quote, in his great lithe embrace, end quote. This ambivalence provides the scene with overtones of a sadomasochistic love tryst. The fact that, quote, this living lump of appetites, end quote, uses his moist, pointed tongue to both caress and injure the woman seems to cry out for Freudian reading. After the night has passed in this fashion, the morning dawns on an exhausted, if still untrustworthy, Indian devil who bears more than a faint resemblance to a spent lover. Not only is the Indian devil responsive to the woman's domesticity and religion, she is in turn responsive to his instinctual presence. What the woman resents most about the beast is the realization that his otherness may, quote, be known by the strength of our lower natures let loose, that the base cursed thing howls with us forever through the forest, end quote. The woman suspects that she is inextricably involved with the animal, that its otherness are her own repressed instincts in exteriorized form. The real threat of being devoured may consist in the danger of being consumed by one's own instinctual drives. So much for Spofford's ecological erotics. The more obvious this implication of the Indian devil's attack becomes, the stronger the need for its repression. In the third and final part of the story, this repression and the beast's elimination are effected by the woman's husband, who appears with their baby on one arm and a gun in the other, long after his wife has given up on him and put her sole trust in God. Finally, he emerges. The husband manages to shoot the Indian devil when he tries to snatch the woman and to escape King Kong style. As she lands on the beast, the woman remains uninjured by her fall from the tree, but also in close physical contact with the Indian devil to the very end. The woman leaves behind the experience with the Indian devil like a dream and feels elated and reborn. The reunited family of father, mother, and baby wind their way home through the forest to live happily ever after. But yet another horrible surprise is in store for them when they approach their farm. The crowing of the cocks, which they heard while still in the forest and yearningly understood as, quote, a cheerful home sound full of safety and all comfort and rest, reveals itself in hindsight as a warning signal against an attack on their settlement. Quote, there is no home there. The log house, the barns, the neighboring farms, the fences are all blotted out and mingled in one smoking ruin. Desolation and death were indeed there, and beneficence and life in the forest. Death and desolation and civilization, beneficence and life in the forest. Tomahawk and scalping knife descending during that night had left behind them only this work of their accomplished hatred and one subtle footprint in the snow. Ending is once again strangely ambivalent. Finishing off one Indian devil in the forest does not preclude the others from destroying one's home. It is perhaps still better to trust the precarious protectiveness of nature than to believe in the permanence of civilization. Considering the story's title, Circumstance, the seemingly contingent attack of the beast appears as a godsend rather than a catastrophe. The animal is perhaps the blessing by God's grace which the woman invokes against him. Had the animal not captured the woman in the forest, husband and child would have remained at home with her. In that case, they would most probably all have been killed by the Native Americans and their raid. As matters stand, the forest episode of The Beauty and the Beast has at least saved all their lives, even if their property has been destroyed. The Indian devil may be the most potent aggressor, but also the most potent rescuer of all. The Indian devil's brutality is counteracted not only by his eroticization through his sadistic enchantment with the woman, produced by her sustained singing, but also by comparison with the swift, uncompromising, and lethal destructiveness of the Native Americans, who are portrayed as extremely aggressive, who extinguished the settlement. Judging by the remnants of the farms, methodically and completely reduced to lifeless ruins, no song, be it ever so sweet, moving, or saintly, would have stayed the tomahawks and torches of these invaders. Against this background, the Indian devil and the dangers of the forest appear hopeful. Spofford characterizes this inversion in one of the last sentences of her story: desolation and death in the civilized world, and beneficence and life in the forest. Perhaps a premonition of empathetic posthumanism, interspecies solidarity, and universal courtesy mentioned in the talks of this conference. The attack on the white settlement by Native Americans at the end of Circumstance enlarges to life-size the inter-ethnic conflicts which, in Poe's Murders in the Remorque, have shrunk to the peculiar knot of a sailor's hair ribbon, which identifies him as the owner of the murderous ape, and which only Dupin is shrewd enough to identify as Maltese, and thereby as marking colonial victimization. So this is post-colonialism in very circumstantial ways. Le Fanu's Green Tea does for the cosmological and theological implications of the Murders in the Remorque what Circumstance does for the aspects of race and gender. Green Tea unfolds the dialectics of fear and hope connected with the conflict of science and religion in the Victorian age. In all three tales discussed, the animal presences function as symptoms or condensed nodes of repressed and ambivalent cultural problems as projection screens rather than as independent entities of their own. The taboo desire for exploitation of people of different sex and race, the fear of and attraction by civilizational progress godless rationalism, disorienting urbanization, as well as the imagined security of Christian or unorthodox belief systems. Perhaps what follows are some final methodological remarks which may have or not, or perhaps also not, some significance with regard to the question of the viability of interspecies alignments and entanglements posed during this conference. The interrelations of universalist and particularist dimensions within and among these 19th century short fictions deviously link them to the current and perhaps not so current anymore debate of universalism and particularism, species orientation and ethnos orientation, as it is conducted by Richard Rorty, Michael Walzer, Charles Taylor, and many others. Rorty, by the way, is the son of an Irish immigrant, which makes him pertinent here. In his influential essay, Solidarity or Objectivity, Rorty defines his pragmatism as a particularism governed by the consensual and temporary fixation of group beliefs, as opposed to the universalist assumption of an objective correlation between cognition and reality. Quote, to be ethnocentric is to divide the human race into the people to whom one must justify one's beliefs and the others, end quote. To adapt Richard Rorty's pragmatic ethnocentrism to our concern with interspecies commonalities during this conference, we could ask whether species orientation is itself a narrow form of ethnocentrism and not universalism at all, as it excludes the animal world and also, for instance, Jane Bennett's vibrant matter to extend this trajectory still further. We could reflect whether we also have to justify our beliefs to other species and whether they also have to justify themselves to us, whether they are accountable in ways comparable to the ways we feel accountable. In any case, the circle of the we that is constituted by such questions comprises those who seek to transcend the confines of both ethnos and species orientation. Rorty considers such complex and overdetermined metaphors as the animals in the stories discussed, stimuli to new knowledge rather than part of what is already known. Metaphors are, in his reading, unfamiliar noises, as he calls them in the title of one of his essays, which stimulate the change of worldviews. Quote, we come to understand metaphors in the same way that we come to understand anomalous natural phenomena. We do so by revising our theories so as to fit them around the new material. We interpret metaphors in the same sense in which we interpret such anomalies, by casting around for possible revisions in our theories which may help to handle the surprises, end quote. In the case of 19th century animal culture, as manifested in the stories discussed or at least mentioned, the no doubt still disturbing images of ape, monkey, and Indian devil appear as anomalous natural phenomena and make us cast about to change our theories of reality. These animals have perhaps helped build the very conceptual cages in which we by now try to catch them. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this really insightful and also very fitting talk. Actually, continuing some of the discussions we had this morning about gender, colonial, post-colonial.
Yeah.
So we do take a few more minutes, obviously, for questions. We started later. Always open questions. If not,
just answer a question. In the first two stories, the animal seems to be a phantom, or is at least not that easy to kind of locate. Is there any suggestion that the panther is also a figment of the woman's imagination, and or is it a real? Because it's
Not really.
not acting like a.
Yeah, not really. I mean, this is a very extended story, and this singing goes on and on. I mean, this is the 19th century, right? I mean, they haven't read Hemingway or microfiction or something. And that gives it a realistic ring, sort of, and you have time while you read this to imagine this woman in the grasp of this very large and probably aggressive animal who seems to hesitate because this is a reaction he has not received before when he perhaps swallowed something, in short shrift of them before, but here she begins to sing these church hymns and jigs and reels and stuff. This is something new, perhaps also for the other species, if you like.
Indigenous mythologies of North America would see animals as being really people, in a more kind of, the way we're kind of coming around to seeing them again. So I didn't know if is there any kind of connection to the Native American?
Well, I mean, there are interpretations of the story that say this is just a stand-in for a Native American. He's a brave or something who, instead of immediately raping and scalping and so forth, does not do that.
Yeah, interesting.
Question, was that again earlier?
No, I was nodding, but I was wondering something that Maureen touched upon. I think with the Post story, the orangutan is never present.
No.
And then in I don't know that I haven't read the Fanu story, and it seems to be a figment of the imagination of the character. And with the circumstance, I think it's also ambivalent, but the story doesn't work if we understand it just as a vision. Something is there. We just don't know. Is it a human? Is it a non-human? There's this ambivalence.
Is it supernatural, maybe, some kind of like? No, I don't. Yeah,
to a certain extent, I mean, to a certain extent, all these animals in all these stories are projection screens to a certain degree. And also this is a late development that the orangutan has been connected with post-colonialist readings, like Dupin, also the post-colonial critic has to dig deep in order to find this dimension in the story. But of course, if you want to find it, you find in many texts aspects that were submerged before. But I also think that Spofford's story is closest, or the animal in Spofford's story is closest to not being a projection screen, and that she is, to a certain extent, working towards possibilities of a different, rearranged relationship characters, if you want, in the story. The Indian devil and the woman behave in very unusual ways, which we wouldn't expect, and which are perhaps not so very probable, but nevertheless, yes.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask about that. Do you think there's a gender difference there, that we always have men who are opposed to animals, whereas women will kind of try to communicate with animals?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, in a sense, yes. I mean, she's not the emancipated new woman, not at all. But at first, she thinks of the domestic sphere and of a male presence, and she is sort of annoyed by the fact that her husband doesn't appear, but of course he can cannot know that where she is and why she doesn't come back more quickly. But nevertheless, then she appeals to God, and in the end, practically to the Indian devil himself, and that is perhaps maybe a feminine reaction in the other stories. I mean, the animals are not as integrated into the plot structure of the story.
But I think it's just a remark, but I think isn't it remarkable that, she ventures into the wilderness, through the wilderness, she's on an errand, she's been taking care of an animal or something. That's very, I'd say feminine or something. But then she braves the wilderness and he tends to the baby at home. And then he comes not exactly to her rescue, I think at that point, it's very late in the story, with a baby in his arms. So it's not that we do have this, there's not these very clear-cut gender roles that we see in the story. I think it's breaking it up a bit. Yeah.
It's amazing, I think.
I've never said this as well.
It's a very interesting story, I think.
Could I also ask you, I mean, it's very 19th century, and I'm really glad you have the 19th century Indian. I was immediately reminded, I'm not familiar with green tea either, but I was immediately reminded, perhaps obviously, of Sherlock Holmes, and also a similar split there, rationalism and the desire to explain everything. And we have numerous animals also in Sherlock Holmes. And I wondered actually, the Fanu is earlier than Conan Doyle. Is there an influence there? Is there? I mean, we have the speckled man, we have the Indian snake in that case, not a monkey, but we do have numerous of these kind of colonial animal intersections in Sherlock Holmes as well.
I don't know whether there is whether green tea or In a Glass Darkly influenced the Sherlock Holmes fiction. What is usually mentioned with regard to Le Fanu is Dracula and Bram Stoker, and that he obviously that there are obvious influences, and that he was influenced by Dickens. He published him all the year round. At first, he for many years he owned the Dublin University magazine and practically filled it with with his stories. It is also, I think, that at the heart of this is our biographical considerations and psychological considerations. After all, I mean, it is not only Reverend Jennings, but Le Fanu's own father was a clergyman in the Church of Ireland, and religion plays a great role also in his life, also in the religious doubts of his wife, from which she died as only Victorians can. I mean, probably there were other causes, but yes, I mean, especially Victorian women, they somehow lie down and then. But I mean, religion was a serious concern for him, and the detective aspect is perhaps not so strong in Green Tea. There is another story called The Watcher, and later The Familiar, also integrated in A Glass Darkly. It's an earlier story, originally published earlier, in which it has a similar structure, also a paranoid persecution of a man by, in this case, an appearance that is easier to see through and identify, that is not as defamiliarized and uncanny as the monkey, namely a small man, an irate small man, and it so happens that he is the father of the woman the protagonist wronged, and therefore he appears all the time. It is also an expression of his bad conscience, if you like. And that is, of course, there the relationship is much clearer than in the monkey, which is at first interesting but different and difficult to explain.
Well, final question, yes.
You mentioned King Kong, which is often connected. Referring to 1930s movie, it's often connected with the Great Migration and the rise of the economic rise of the Afro-American community. And King Kong founding Empire State Building is often considered an attack or challenge of was economic superiority. But I would say when King Kong is shot by the Air Force, because Empire State Building and was economic prosperity remains fairly intact. And the story you mentioned, it's quite different because the settlers' homes, they are burned and annihilated by Native Americans. So to see.
Yeah, no, I mean, the comparison, of course, doesn't fit. I mean, it was a bit ironic also, but the gesture is described as being similar. You know, he is about to carry the wife off, and then the husband puts the baby down and considers that's only the rifle. But I mean, yes, I mean, I just have this association. It's anachronistic, of course. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. We're not only grateful, we're actually delighted.